Bradshaw report came out in the early 80s, which showed that the level of heroin use in the North Inner City was matching that of some of the ghettos in New York. What happened, as well as say, the drug taking, the escalation in crime, you had also the HIV and AIDS. So there were many young people, sadly, ended up getting infected, and many of them died. So it was a real human tragedy, and it was a great shame that the state didn't respond quicker and didn't respond in partnership. The general trust of the concerned parents were the group of people and the campaign that was focusing on what the issues were, which was the massive social harm caused by drug dealing and drug taking of heroin in those areas, and the state's inadequate response. They were the issues, and the government, I think, made a fundamental mistake of not trying to co-opt or get in partnership with the majority of people who are involved in the concerned parents. I think that might have been a possibility. That's what happened later on in the 90s. But most of the areas where heroin moved and where it was being pushed were areas that had similar characteristics to the inner city. So, for example, the social index of problems like poor housing, unemployment, early school leaving, it was in areas that had those sort of characteristics that the heroin spread to most quickly. And so by the 90s, despite whatever the government had been doing, and I would be argued they hadn't been doing very much, and you had now communities organising right throughout. So again, the North Inner City, the concerned parents had gone, but there was a group called ICON, the Inner City Organisations Network, and they put drugs issue to the fore, and ICON set up a response locally by trying to involve all the key players and by having a street campaign that mirrored the sort of street campaign that the concerned parents had done, but also by lobbying. So ICON's approach was maybe a bit more sophisticated than the concerned parents, in the sense that it got together the key players, came up with policy alternatives and so forth. But also many people within ICON and other people approached ICON and said, look, can we not look at getting a citywide response to this, because it is no longer just a north and south inner city problem. It's a city, a broad city response. So that's where the birth of CityWide came. As well as the marching, the Veronica Gearin, the facts and the figures, we now had evidence to show we've had the drug problem since the 80s. What have we done about it? It's spilt over onto the streets. There's additional crime. All those things came together, and the government knew that if it wanted to address this problem, the people who'd been trying to address it on the ground, their sort of views and the views of those type of groups had to be taken on board. And there was some already existing partnership structures where people got together around other issues like unemployment. But I think CityWide played a very big role, because they had gone to government, and they'd gone to government not only giving out, but also going with a programme of what needed to be done. If you look at the earlier documentation of CityWide, CityWide not only said, look, we have a serious problem, we think the government isn't doing sufficient about it, it also said, and here's what we think should be done. But it did include things like saying, look, well, in the North Inner Cities, there's the Interagency Drugs Project, you get all the people together, all the key players, and you try and come up with a coherent plan. What made CityWide different than the others, that it had people engaged in it from a broad spectrum, from the women in the communities on the ground, to people in the universities, to trade union people. And because of that, CityWide was able to come up with sort of rational, sensible approaches forward, which the government, to be fair to them, when they looked at them, felt that fair enough, maybe this is something we can go with. What had attracted some of us at the start to the government response in the early days was the fact that you had drugs at a national level, on the political level. You had a cabinet committee on drugs, chaired by the Taoiseach, with health, education, justice, the key departments on it. So you had a very clear political structure, cabinet committee on drugs, chaired by the Taoiseach. You had a national drug strategy team, and you had local drugs task forces. Boom, boom, boom. They went out about setting up and doing their plans. They sent their plans in to us. We approved the plans, sent them to government, and away we went. And there was, for a couple of years, a real innovative, radical, effective response. So CityWide's role moved from being campaigning to be facilitating, in a sense. But it also maintained its, and so, for example, if there were issues that arose, we would have been, CityWide would have been in favour of, say, the argument of having alcohol involved in the strategy. Harm reduction, there was a big debate right through, even with these structures, and the ongoing debate that's in every society between do you focus on harm reduction measures, or are harm reduction measures really just a sop and you never get people off drugs and you leave them on methadone forever. All those sort of arguments. CityWide would have engaged with information and seminars to try to update itself on those issues. For the first couple of years, action, if there was difficulties, let's try and overcome them. Gradually then, as the years went by, that political, and as the problem kind of got less, because there was communities where, not happy, but communities were at least engaging with this, and where you had this antagonism, people were now prepared to give the help or the chance. New projects were set up, there was more treatment, there was initiatives in relation to education and prevention, there was initiatives like community policing in some areas that were very effective in terms of trying to address some of the policing issues. And there was also, a national focus on it. But gradually then, that cabinet committee then got rid of it. Over the years, it's like the disappearing cat in Alice in Wonderland. Drugs is there, very clear, government. Then it's gradually fading and fading. But a lot of what had been achieved was very good. It was the whole attitudinal change. It was the whole issue of saying, look, we've made some progress on this. Their attitude seemed to us to be saying this. Look, this was a problem. It's finished. We're over it. Let's move on. So CityWide would still be saying, this agenda isn't finished. We still have a massive drugs problem. We're going to have a massive drugs problem, and we can't take our foot off the pedal. It would still seem to me that when we started in CityWide, we were motivated by saying, look, what's happening here is completely wrong. What's happening here doesn't have to happen, and we as a society can do something about it. That is still there, and even though people are tired and so on, I still think that message, we can get it across to younger people or to other people, whether they're young or old, and say that there is still a role for the group that faces up to the problems and tries to analyse them objectively. And a lot of it is based on the principles that we went for and supported at the time the government responded. It was about saying we need to set up structures that dealing with complex issues are cross-cutting, but also have that link to the community or the NGO sector. That isn't just the state talking to the state, it's the state also talking to other people. And we need to engage with the new communities, and by the new communities I don't mean just the immigrants, but they're very essential to me. Ireland has changed, the inner city has changed. Where we are around this area, about 25% of the North Inner City might be people who are born outside of Ireland. So we need to engage with those people because there are specific issues around that, but also we need to engage with some of those groups of communities that were excluded and whom the drugs and alcohol issues impact more on, like the gay community, lesbian community, like travellers, etc. So I think we can again create a broad coalition based around a rational response to the drugs and alcohol crisis. That, to me, is the challenge for CityWide. And despite the fact people are tired, the challenge is still there because the issue is still there. And if the issue is still there, I know people will come forward, whether the current people within CityWide or other people that we should try to attract in. So there's a huge role, and that role is there for CityWide because it currently still has that facilitation role for the people who are in the local and the regional drug task force. And even though they've emasculated the national structures, the local structures are still there and could be reactivated quite quickly. And indeed, if the government will is there, you can reactivate the sort of dynamic, responsive type of structures at a national level that will respond to the drugs and alcohol crisis. It's still a huge issue, and it's a massive economic issue as it always was, massive. It's also a massive social issue, and our failure to address it will be a huge indictment of all of us. So there is a huge role still for CityWide, there still is a huge challenge, and I would be hopeful that the people who created CityWide and also new people will rise to that challenge.